Hello, and welcome to the Awakening Educator. I'm Susan Andrian.
I'm Megan Sweet.
And we are so excited today to have Dr. Kimya Nuru Dennis with us from 365 Diversity. And we'll let Kimya introduce herself.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm Dr. Kimya Nuru Dennis. I am an activist, sociologist, criminologist, educator, researcher, and founder of 365 Diversity. So anyone, of course, if you go to 365diversity.com, you can see my background, being born and raised in Richmond, Virginia, and how my background in my personal life contributes to my life when I was full-time academician and all the work that I do in not only talking about equity and justice, but actually contributing to the work to have measurable and lasting equity and justice. Beyond just talking about theories and having trainings, we're actually talking about doing real work and doing measurable work. So thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much for being here. And how would you like us to call you? Would you like us to call you Kimya, Dr. Dennis? What's your preference for today?
You can call me Dr. So my name is pronounced Kimya.
Kimya,
so it's spelled with an I, pronounced with a long E. So you can call me Dr. Kimya Nuru, or Dr. Dennis. Okay. Whichever is most exciting to you, I go by all three.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for coming. And
thank you.
When we checked in before the show, for me, it was really exciting to hear about, I love the notion of the name 365 Diversity. And it's something that we did a show on Monday where we were speaking with some folks who created an organization called A Long Talk. And what they were talking about was, that there's a challenge right now. I think there's a lot of awareness in our society right now that equity is, things aren't equitable, that we have an issue with white supremacy and racism in this country. And what I'm seeing anyways, a lot of organizations are coming back with these quick little trainings. They're trying to hire folks to come in and do a quick training. And what we discussed on Tuesday was that actually can cause more harm than promote true equity in an organization, because you come in, it's not a drive-by moment to address equity and racism in our country or in our organizations, but it requires consistent, prolonged, active steps towards creating a more equitable space wherever it is. So I was really excited to hear about that. And I know that you and I talked about that briefly. But maybe you can share us a little bit more about when you're talking about 365 equity. What does that look like to you, or what does that mean to you?
Yeah, so 365 Diversity is based on the inclusion and equity that is everywhere. So underserved, minoritized, marginalized individuals and groups do not have to pick and choose. You can't tell us, well, we're allowing you to come to this restaurant now, so therefore ignore the fact that the police are stalking your neighborhood. We don't have to pick and choose. That's not how this works. And so my specialization is based in centuries of Black activism scholarship, which is based in tens of thousands of years of sciences, mathematics, knowledges around the world, including on the continent of Africa. So I am a Black sociologist and Black criminologist whose expertise is based on this century of work, published books that are not based on just DEI, D&I acronyms, trainings, and anti-racism phrase, not based on hashtags. I always tell people, if your work is based on a hashtag on social media, if your work is just based on stuff that you discovered this year, you can't do equity work if you're pretending that this equity work just started. Black people have been doing racial justice trainings, workshops, classes for white people since the 1960s. So this is not a new thing. We have tried this for more than 50 years. And so I want people to understand that we keep regurgitating the same thing over and over again. We have tons of theories. Something that's new to white people does not mean it's new in existence. It means it's new to white people. And it's not hidden information. It's just selective vision based on what white people intentionally omit from libraries, from K through 12 curriculum, from college university curriculum. And so that's when I talk about what this means to me. It means not just this uncomfortable conversation, it means actual changes. So like, I don't just converse. I always tell people, we've talked a lot. We have centuries of talking while white people have hanged us from trees, right? So after a while, we have to say, okay, you all already know this information. Here's some changes that we're going to talk about. And don't just send me to the White House or to talk to politicians. We're talking about changes that's right in front of people's lives, their place of employment, the schools, their communities, and everywhere. So it's real action beyond yelling at Black people to vote or die, beyond all that stuff.
So I thank you. I think that's a helpful context. And I've heard you say, when I was listening to some of your other interviews, this idea of really moving beyond theory. We spend a lot of time sitting in rooms, talking, maybe crying, connecting with each other, but that doesn't always lead to actionable change. And so what are some of the specific actionable change that you would like to see specifically in schools? Because Megan and I are really, this shows our audience is mostly educators. And we think it's really important that these conversations are happening from the pre-K, preschool, all the way up through the college level. So what are some of the actionable items that you think are things that need to happen on a day-to-day basis, 365, to really change how people feel and live day to day?
Yeah, so when we're talking about this, I also specialize in changing medical and health system and removing police. And so it's all these different components, because when we talk about schools, you also got to talk about the SROs and it's different layers and different disguises. So like I tell educators, I want people to log off social media, stop these hashtags, stop saying that COVID-19 has oppressed teachers and pretending that most teachers have been doing a good job before COVID-19 happened. That's falsehood. First of all, most school teachers, most school decision makers, and most school officials have been compliant, complacent, and contributive to the inequities and injustices in school materials and school policies and practices, whether that's talking about racial disparities, whether that's talking about LGBTQIA disparities, whether it's talking about overall gender inequities, ableism in schools. Everyone has been compliant and they've contributed to it in some way. And that includes silence, compliance, just saying that you need a paycheck so you can't challenge anyone, going to these professional development requirements, knowing good and well you're just there because you have to be there, but nothing's going to be challenged and nothing's going to be changed. And so that's the first thing I always tell teachers, school officials, and overall school decision makers. So from there, I always say, beyond going to all these professional development sessions, just like I tell medical and health professionals when you go to CEU credit trainings, why are you here? There's mostly silence, but people will say, I want to learn something. You know, as grown adults, after a while, you got to stop pretending you don't already know, right? Right? It's just like, you know, again, I was a tenured associate professor. I created a crime academic program. You know, I was in charge of program assessments and my contribution to the accreditation process for 10 years. I know what it means when students come into the classroom and we as educators tell the students, I've already explained this to you. So now show me what you know, right? So the same thing pertains to when we talk about K through 12 educators. You already know the inequities, okay? You already know that the accreditation agencies are based on European white version of knowledge, which either ignores tens of thousands of years of knowledges from around the world, Asian diaspora, indigenous, Aboriginal, African continent, sciences, mathematics, literatures, and arts, right? Most people come from K through 12, including predominantly Black and Indigenous K through 12 schools, and also come from colleges and universities, including terminal degrees, believing that European white people either invented everything or are the main discoverers of knowledge. And that connects with what's represented in museums. There are grown adults, teachers even, who teach that museums are shaped by Africans and Indigenous people, for example, going to museums and saying, hey, we want our stuff included in the museum. That's not true. How do most museums, especially the very popular ones, get the materials that they have in a museum?
I don't know.
Yeah. So there's a reason why there's some recent stories about museums giving back the displays back to the cultures where the displays came from. Right? So you might have had usually European white archaeologists who, when they say discovered something, that usually means they've intruded, right? Same thing, we talk about the origins of white Anglo-Saxon Protestantism, forms of Judaism, Catholicism. It's about imposing in other spaces and declaring yourselves the discoverers, as though thousands of years of people didn't already know that existed. So when we're talking about changing schools, we literally have to change everything that shapes the European white version of invention, discovery, knowledge, and testing knowledge, which then that goes to the whole standardized test process as well.
Yeah.
And so I was interviewed for another podcast today, and the wonderful interviewer did ask me about how we prepare Black and brown children for tests and for careers. She asked if we're supposed to just subscribe to certain beliefs in order to prepare people for a career that's based on those beliefs. And I don't believe in subscribing to inequities, right? Because when we talk about inequities, we're not talking about theoretical inequities. We're talking about real life stuff. Thousands of years for some identities, centuries for other identities. So you can't say theoretically we want justice. It's real life, right? So therefore, K through 12 and colleges and universities should not be preparing people for education and a career based on this falsehood that white people either discovered everything or are the main developers of everything. And so when I talk about this, it's very common for white people, including white teachers, to ask me, oftentimes they're rhetorically asking me because they really don't, but they'll say things like 1 + 1 = 2. How can there be racism in that? And I always tell people, particularly white people, that why is 1 + 1 = 2 always the retort from white people, as if thousands of years of mathematics boils down to 1 + 1 = 2, right? That's why it's a rhetorical question, because you really just want something basic like 1 + 1 = 2, which the fact is that we have thousands of years of knowledges, including Indigenous, Asian, and African colors and shapes that have formed mathematics, right? So I gave a long answer, but there's so much that goes into this because people want a quick solution. Why? Because most people do not want to go through the process. They don't want to exhaust themselves, which means they don't want to change anything.
Yeah, so I appreciate that framing, Dr. Dennis, and you're talking to a former teacher, history teacher, school administrator, and I'm a school board member. So, so I'm all those, and I'm a white woman. So, and I agree with you that we have a white supremacist perspective that we have created our education system around, right? So it's embedded in the society with implicit biases that are shaping the way that all of us see ourselves and one another. But let's say in an education settings, when we have a lot of white identified folks that need to do a lot of work around developing their understanding of a lot of what you just shared, and they're in front of kids that don't share their same backgrounds, it creates a lot of problems. You're also naming adjustments to our curriculum and our approach. And I think all of those are needed. And as somebody who made a lot of attempts, has over my career, made a lot of inroads and attempts to make those changes, those are also what you're naming are significant changes to how we approach instructing our kids, shaping our schools, forming our curriculum. So I'm just wondering where you think where do we begin? I'm not trying to give a 1 + 1 = 2. I don't want a quick solution. I get that this is hard, but I also, my mind goes to, there's so much we need to do. And I am literally in the place of like, where do we begin? So I'm really curious from a genuine curious place of like, where do we begin to start to make those changes? Because the whole system is, the whole system needs to be redesigned. I personally don't always know where to begin myself. So I'm just curious where you think, where do we begin to do that kind of work?
Well, for starters, Indigenous people and Black people have explained where to begin for centuries. So whenever people ask where do we begin, I tell people that means you are intentionally ignoring what Indigenous people and African Black people have said in spoken word and in written works for centuries. Literally, Indigenous people and Black people have written up curriculum, oftentimes for free, and presented it to schools across the nation and in Canada.
Well, I guess I just want to push back. I mean, I'm not intentionally, I just don't know where it is. So I'm not intentionally ignoring it. I'm also just don't necessarily have access to the information. So I guess I'm asking that question of like, how do we start to find that information out?
Right. So this is not just in response to you, Megan. This is in response to white people in general, because it's similar to when we're talking about changing police departments. And when we talk about white supremacy, that's not white people of a particular political party. It literally is centuries of white people of every political party and every voting pattern. Okay. And that's important to clarify because most white liberals, most white progressives, most white anti-fascists did not wake up until 2016. And they did not get out of the bed until 2020 during COVID and Black Lives Matter protests that they personally decided to care about. Okay. So we have to be honest that situational consciousness does not mean that information was previously hidden. It means that white power and white privilege, which is not based in bias, it's based in measurable outcomes and power. When you're comfortable in white power, that means you can ignore the work that's come before you, even if it's in library, get upon yourself to find it. So think about this if we were talking about gender equity in schools, right? Most oftentimes, cisgender people and men in particular will pretend that gender equity work has been hidden. However, the awesome thing about some libraries is that they allow you to do a search engine, don't they? And you will find a whole bunch of stuff that LGBTQIA people have done, that girls and women have done. And you'll be like, why was I never told this? Well, of course we know why, right? You're not told this because American schools and schools in parts of the world, but particularly American schools, are based on memorization, regurgitation. This falsehood that you're not going to research on your own. You're going to literally go based on everything that you're told to learn, darn it, and nothing more. So for me, I come from a family of Black educators and Black intellectuals who they taught us what was not presented in our Black schools. Because unfortunately, our Black schools in Richmond, where I'm born and raised, Second Capital Confederacy, is still controlled by white people. So my parents actually forced us to learn stuff. And that's the biggest threat, right? When you're actually learning stuff and you're saying, there's centuries of knowledge. We have literally publications, books that you can't find in most libraries, that are omitted from curriculum, that are not captured in tests. Let's actually research this and figure out what needs to be added. So when we say what needs to happen, how can we change this? First, we have to understand why people are unfamiliar with the existence of all these different forms of knowledge.
It's hard to believe, but we are coming up on our first commercial break. It's been a powerful conversation to start, and we're going to take a quick break and come back with Dr. Dennis to continue this conversation. Welcome back to the Awakening Educator. We are so excited to have Dr. Dennis here today to talk about 365 diversity and how to bring this conversation of real actionable change versus getting stuck in theory to our schools. And before we went out on break, we were talking about what is omitted from our curriculum, what is omitted from our schools. What are we not teaching our kids that's readily available, but just not present in day-to-day education? And I know I've been listening kind of intently, thinking about where I've been sitting in this work for the last 25 years as an educator, and really having to come to terms with the fact that despite a career that has been working towards equity, or at least thinking that I feel like that's a value that something that I value, that I've worked towards, that despite that, I continue to be a part of a system that perpetuates inequity for students of color. And so recognizing that there are teachers, there are pockets in the system that I'm in that are doing amazing things with bringing curriculum and action and experience to young people, so that it wakens that understanding of power and in them to be able to fight for education that is more inclusive of full histories. But those are pockets. And I think, thinking back to Megan's question around how are we driving systems, moving from the individual powerful teachers that have this knowledge, that share this knowledge with students, because I know some really amazing teachers who are doing this work on a day-to-day, to how do we drive the conversation so that all of our students equitably have access to knowledge in a way that is going to shift it. The other thing that was really resonating for me is that this is all situated in a capitalist, not only is it white supremacist, we are in a white supremacist culture in America, but we're very much in a capitalist culture, and that those two are intertwined in a way that is you cannot undo them. They're connected intrinsically. And so how do we start to, within this capitalist culture, knowing that equity continues to be an issue that we have not even made a dent in, despite in my career, the 20 years that has been the focus? How do we start to think both systemically and on an individual basis to be anti-racist?
Yeah, so there's different components to that. So first, the interesting thing about teachers and school officials and school administrators, they don't do well collaborating with teachers, school officials, and school administrators in the same state, let alone across the nation and around the world, who are actually making changes. It's embarrassing what it means when you do a professional development session and the teachers are like, how do we do this? And I'm like, you all are members of professional organizations. What do you all talk about when you're networking? Do you all ask each other these questions? I mean, it's scary because it's also hypocritical, because here teachers are supposed to be shaping these generations, right? Oftentimes telling children to learn, challenge, and all that, but teachers and school officials themselves are not really learning and challenging anything. They're not asking what has been done before us. Who are the people before us? Indigenous people, African Black people, many of whom got fired from jobs, got stalked by white people, and it still happens in 2021. They're doing this work, sometimes free labor, unfortunately. They're not only not being thanked and not being paid, but they're being ignored. And so people think that they're getting new ideas, and they're not saying, wait a second, this can't be a new idea. Who has tried this centuries before me? Who has tried this generations before me? I always tell people, if you want to go into education, whether it's K through 12, colleges and universities, see who has come before you. Like in the United States, America, and Canada, more than 50% of K through 12 decision makers, school leaders, and teachers are white people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've used that statistics myself, and it's what's frightening, right? Because
yes.
It's especially since the population of students that we're serving are more than that, number one, and when folks haven't done the work that they need to do, and I will say, as a white person, and like Susan, I've been working at this, I think for 27 years. So in my teaching preparation program, equity was centered in the conversation, and it was an eye opener for me. So as a white person, and I grew up in Berkeley, thinking that I had liberal background and experiences, and thought I understood equity before that moment. I discovered that I was way off. And so for me, it's a daily practice of becoming aware of my biases, unpacking them, getting curious, asking those same questions that you're naming. And it's will continue to be the process for me for the rest of my life, right? Like we don't always arrive here. I'm not going to, if anyone who says that they've arrived, especially a white identified person, that they've got equity down, I get nervous, because it's a constant thing that we need to pay attention to and look into. So I'm hearing from you that part of it is just starting to ask some questions, right? So, and to have dialogue with one another, I think. So I just wanted to make sure I'm hearing your recommendation correctly in some of what you've seen. And I'll agree with you that, educators actually very rarely get to meet together in professional spaces, and collaborating across roles, very rare. Collaborating across states, even more rare. I mean, we have these moments where we have these, I'm going to go to one next week, where, we have these events where we come together at, what's it called? Now I'm losing all my words. What's the word? What's an event when you come together?
A conference.
Thank you. Conferences. And talk there. But those are, again, to me, they're flyby, and they're much more around networking than they are actually about solving problems around how do we change the way we do work in education.
Well, for me, networking has to be about solving problems. Mm-hmm. First of all, I don't want educators to pretend that they only see each other at conferences, because I see a whole bunch of school teachers and school officials rambling on Twitter, hashtagging, going back and forth. Right. So that's another thing. Educators need to stop using excuses. That's another excuse, pretending they don't have access to each other every single day. That includes when educators such as myself provide free information on social media, readings. There's publicly accessible Indigenous mathematics books, African mathematics books. So if you really wanted to change the curriculum to remove the white dominance of mathematics, which includes white women mathematicians, you have information. So we also want to dispel that myth that educators don't have access to other educators. You actually have more access now than you had previous generations, before there was the internet and before there was email correspondence. The issue is how people are utilizing those resources. So just like you're telling those students to utilize resources, the educators need to be role models for utilizing resources. I also want people to go beyond the bias talk. I don't believe in implicit bias trainings and unconscious bias trainings. I believe those are a complete waste of time, and oftentimes waste of money, because what it ends up is a bunch of white people saying, yeah, I have bias. And a bunch of men saying, yeah, I have gendered bias. A bunch of cisgender heterosexuals saying, yeah, I have bias. And at the end of the day, y'all go to lunch. Nothing comes from it. And here's something to think about. Guess what most police departments do across the nation? Bias trainings. And there's no evidence that ever improves police training and ever reduces police abuse of power. Medical and health professionals, guess what they do? And sometimes they get CEU credits for it. Bias trainings. So teachers, police departments, and medical and health providers are similar in that they all have power in some capacity, but they oftentimes pretend they don't have decision-making power when they are held accountable. Everyone pretends that these iniquities, the curriculum, the predominantly white publishers, the predominantly white books are discovered and chosen by alien life forms. Like,
I'd like to
no
bring
one
up
knows.
a couple of examples of folks that are doing exactly what you're talking, who are addressing this in the systemic way. We had Create and Educate on, and I always say they're in Atlanta, but they're in Virginia, I believe. And amazing, Shiga and Tammy, who are working specifically to bring in independent authors into the public schools, who are helping those authors learn how to navigate the contractor system, which is often one of the barriers that keep authors out, that keep curriculum out, that keep the big publishers there. So that's an example of an actionable item where through addressing the systemic barriers, they're building partnerships with authors and curriculum to bring folks of color's curriculum into the public schools. So that's an example of really addressing exactly the structural barriers that you're talking about, because so often those learning how to be a contract to get a PO. I'm trying to remember to be able to get a PO. That process is so complex that unless you really know how to navigate it, you just sort of say, well, that's just an impenetrable system. And so they're really working with folks around that. Another example is, I feel really lucky to be in Oakland Unified still, and I'm part of the racial justice and the Social Justice and Racial Healing Task Force, which is a group of folks from across the district: teachers, administrators, central office folks, HR folks, our equity, Office of Equity. We are a cross section of folks who come together every month to continue to move forward the discussion, to think about what's happening day to day on our school sites, to be thinking about our hiring systems, our recruitment systems, our curriculum. And we have a number of different committees, and are now working towards having equity champions at every school site that are part of our monthly cohort that comes together specifically to take actionable items back to our school sites that change the day-to-day experience of our students. So those are kind of two examples, I think, that are related to what you're encouraging us to do, which is we need to elevate voices, we need to remove barriers, we need to recognize that there is a lot of wisdom that has come from the thousands of years before us, that these things didn't just start now, and that we need to be able to shift practice and experience on day-to-day of students' lives. Is that?
So here's why I push back on school teachers and school decision makers. When you go to every school district in the United States of America, in almost every school, they will claim they have a bunch of equity-based committees. They will claim that they capture equity when they do professional development sessions. So this is why I tell people committees mean nothing. Trainings mean nothing. Unless you're doing 6-month and annual assessments, which is what I specialize in doing for curriculum and library materials, unless you're doing that and pretend it's required for accreditation, even though it's not, you don't need accreditation requirements to force you to be equity focused. Unless you're doing follow-ups, you're just wasting your time. I tell people, if the only thing you can brag about is a bunch of meetings and hearing people's voices, Indigenous people, Black people, Asians, non-white Hispanics, non-white Latinx, Latina, Latino, we've already said enough. We don't need y'all to hear our voices anymore. Now we figured out how to yell and stuff. Now we need actual actions. So, and this is one thing I have to tell every single school: I do not care about your committee. I don't care about the book club that you have a New York Times bestseller, because even that is based on white approval. Guess what? It's a bestseller based on white people's permission, right? A lot of times schools will say they're changing curriculum. They'll say something like, we have a book about, this Indigenous culture. And I say, well, actually, did you check the demographics of the author and publisher and most of the materials in the works cited section? Usually the answer is no. So basically they're using work that's still white people, but it's basically like blackface and brownface. It's still based on this notion that knowledge only exists if you present it as created or presented by white people. And it's unfortunate because a lot of times these committees think they're doing awesome stuff, right? They're like, we've got a whole bunch of work for Indigenous Heritage Month. We got all this stuff. And I tell them, you have to look at the demographics and cultures represented in the creators of this material. So that's why I tell educators, committees are not enough, especially if you all are sitting around and everyone's getting along. If everyone's smiling, then that means nothing is changing, right? Because as it pertains to gender equity, cisgender people and men know how to smile when they know that nothing's going to change regardless. White people, as it pertains to racial issues, know how to smile when they know that white people will be the decision makers regardless of how many trainings and committees we have. So that's something to think about.
Yeah, I was going to say I think that's a helpful starting point of or framing, and I've seen it myself, and I think I talked about it when we were interviewing Shika actually around books. So I think that those are I'm grasping for the things that I can feel like I can walk away with and do too. And so one of them I'm hearing is, which is a great point, an important point, was actually looking at who wrote the book, what's the background of the person who wrote the book, what are their references,
the publishers,
because you're right. Often, people think they're being like helpful or supportive by creating a multicultural book. This is the example I gave the other day, which to me was, typifies the problem, which was, it was a book about a Japanese family. And they had the child wearing a gi, which is a martial arts jacket, or it was even just a jacket. But actually in Japanese culture, which way you put the flaps of that jacket mean two different things. So, and the whole time the child was walking around with the flap on in the way that would signify that he had died. So you only put the flap that way when someone has died. So for me, that's a concrete example of, right, someone thinks that they're being helpful or not, or they're taking advantage of popularity and having multicultural books, what have you, but actually are absolutely doing the opposite and causing harm to the community that they're supporting. And if they'd been spoken to a person of color, a Japanese person, they would have caught that at 50 paces and been like, right, nope.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really helpful thing, because you're right. Textbook publishers, everything else, is what's been making me nervous and uncomfortable is with this wave of DEI trainings or creating positions to address diversity, equity, and inclusion in organizations. Those just become roles without any teeth underneath them, no opportunities to actually create change unless we're really mean it and are going to do something about it. And causes further harm. So a lot of, and I've seen plenty of people, especially in the Black Lives Matter movement, doing a lot of performative Black Lives Matter actions, right? They've got the poster. It's a real point of pain within my community, the posters that are up, but then, we also had a person of color be killed in police custody. Yeah, in police custody for being mentally ill in a park. So we have a lot of huge issues to address. And so I'm just appreciating, like, that's a concrete, specific thing. I'm also hearing, like, do your homework, and there's plenty out there, and we don't need other folks to tell us, we don't need people of color to tell us where to look, that actually we can search and look for ourselves for resources.
Right.
Yeah.
So here's some things to think about. So first of all, I'm not a person of color. I'm an African Black person. And I say that because for centuries, we've been called colored by white people. So I refuse to use any color acronyms and phrases. And that's important to know, because when I do presentations and trainings, it's oftentimes white people who get offended when having to learn the different terminology in different settings. So that's another example of white power, when you can get offended because you're being challenged. Just like when we're talking about LGBTQIA rights and cisgender heterosexual people are offended because we don't allow cisgender heterosexual people to determine the reality of the world, right? So that's one thing to consider. Another thing is why I challenge educators, because it's very common for educators to ignore every single thing I'm saying, and then they'll ask me, well, what should we do? And that's actually quite insulting, because what that conveys to people with underserved primary identities is that you want a cliff notes. You don't want to listen to the larger message that we have. You want us to give you a quick answer to your question. I want you to think about what that means, right? What it means when someone with an underserved primary identity is explaining something to you, because we're talking about thousands of years of injustices for some identities and centuries for other identities. We're explaining that to you, right? At the end of that explanation, if the only thing you can say is, well, what should we do then? That's basically a way of politely saying, shut up and tell me an answer quickly, okay? And that shows, though, the inability to not only be inconvenienced and uncomfortable, but this need to get a quick solution, and oftentimes for free as well, because you're not paying the person to help you do the work. So that's something, and a school administrator just asked a question in terms of what should be done.
And I think it was specifically around to move beyond the committee phase.
Yep. So it's a similar thing. First, you have to have honest discussion. Why are we doing this committee? Well, it's just like every business and every organization's committee. Most of them are not really doing anything. They're just having a committee because they're told they have to have a committee. There are so many committees in schools that all they do is talk. And so, for example, I used to be chair of a curriculum committee for college. And I always tell people, like, what's really going to come from this? What are you really going to change? Usually the answer is nothing. So when you say, how do we get people beyond the committee? You have to have that discussion when people join committees. This is the purpose of this committee. These are the measurable outcomes that we're. Now, here's another thing when we're talking about K through 12 schools. You're controlled by politicians, you're controlled by school officials, school decision makers, you're controlled by taxpayers and voters. And even when it's talking about Indigenous, Hispanic, non-white, Latinx, Latina, Latino, and Black people, the opinions that matter the most are white people. And this is for every school district in the United States of America. White people's opinions are the only opinions that matter. Even if there are Indigenous school officials, all that matters are whether white people approve and whether white people are offended. So that honesty needs to be part of a committee. If you have to have a committee, that needs to be the discussion, is what changes are we going to be able to make without the accreditation agency finding a way to punish us, because these people know how to do stuff, don't they? Like when you're not complying. And what will politicians do? So now the big thing is critical race theory, a theory from the 1980s that Black activists, scholars, and a white man originated, based in centuries of Black activism and scholarship. I always tell people, why are you wasting time arguing about critical race theory? And especially with white people. Like literally, you can address the critical process of racial identities and racial disparities without even using the phrase critical race theory. I'm a Black social scientist. We have done this for centuries. So when people are going to town halls and doing trainings to address critical race theory, it's usually a distraction to not really address the larger problem. And white liberals are very big at this now. They want to argue about critical race theory. And I'm like, okay, so let's pretend the theory is not the debate. What are you doing to change your curriculum? And that's when people get silent.
So we are past our second break. It was a great conversation, so I didn't want to interrupt. But when we come back, actually we do a educator spotlight. So we have an educator spotlight. We'd love for you to stay with us and watch the educator spotlight, and then hear and have a short conversation before we leave. So we'll go to break. welcome back. I'm going to share my screen, hopefully, get the technology down on this.
We're learning, Dr. Dennis, how to put all these pieces
we're learning
together.
we're this is a new streaming service for us, so we're getting it down.
Yeah, but I just want to appreciate what you're saying around, especially the impatience with bringing back work that's been discussed a long time ago, and the lack of movement around any of the work that we're doing. So I just want to, because I don't want us to like stop the critical race theory conversation and move into this without kind of picking up that thread. That, you know, we have to be willing to change who's in control, who's making decisions, and where the power dynamics are, and should we have committees. That needs to be agreed upon from the outset, because you're right. Otherwise, we're sitting around talking, not getting anything done. And if we don't have an agreement around the outcomes and around actions we're going to take with those outcomes, then we're not actually making any difference. We're not making a change down the line. And one of those things is just determining who makes those choices and being sure that we're centering people from the global majority as the decision makers in those spaces.
Now, keep in mind, there's never going to be a full agreement, right? Sure. Like when we're talking about LGBTQIA rights, when we're talking about changing bathrooms in schools, when we're talking about all this work, when we're talking about changing the curriculum so that it's not white people's version of history, science, mathematics, arts, literature, most people are not going to agree with that. They might not say it at the committee meeting, but they'll contact the white supremacist politician. They'll find all sorts of ways. They'll contact the white supremacists around the world, and white supremacy does not vary by political party again. So this is where school teachers, school decision makers need to say, what is our deal breaker? You have to go into it with the expectation that there's not going to be an agreement, or that there'll be an initial agreement, and then people realize, oh my goodness, their family are white supremacists. They don't want to lose that. It's a whole bunch of nonsense that goes on, right? So this is why I tell school teachers included that what is the incentive for schools to change if you're going to work there regardless? And I've done these presentations for Black school employees, for white school employees, Indigenous, Asian. And the common sentiment is people pretend I don't understand the struggles of the workforce. Like, hello, I'm in this world as well. So, hey, I understand that. Okay. But again, if you're desperate for a job to the point that you will comply with everything regardless, then the decision makers are not going to change anything. Right? Like if they threaten to take away your wages or reduce it, would there be an incentive for them not to do that? You got to think about the same way when talking about equity.
And I think that brings it back to that conversation about this is not only a white supremacist, but it's also capitalism and the power of that relationship between our economy and our schools and white supremacy is undeniable. I do want to transition to our educator spotlight. I am excited about our educator that we're highlighting today. This is at Cambridge Rindge and Latin, which is actually the high school that my husband graduated from. And this is a teacher that I think is doing really powerful work and related to our conversation today. So hopefully I'll be able to do this.
You can do it, Susan. You got it.
I can do it.
Technology.
All right.
Let's
see. Play. Let's see.
Don't forget to share your audio.
Is the audio? Do we hear it?
Nope.
Okay.
Because this happened last time, Susan. What do we do?
Okay, wait a minute. Let's see. All right, now see if that works. Did that work?
No.
No, we can just see an image.
All right.
Remember, I think you don't share your screen because that was the problem.
Share. Oh, I know what I have to do. All right. I know what I have to do.
We should write it down so I remember for next.
It was a Dr. Kimberly Parker.
We're going to have Mr. Kai Estrella edit this out is what we're going to have to do.
Dr. Dennis was asking, is this Dr. Kimberly Parker?
Is that who the
yes,
celebration
that is who we're celebrating today.
Yay, Dr. Parker.
Okay. Let's see. Let's see if this works.
I'm so glad it's you and not me. So
I know.
glad.
Is
I'm
this
gonna
It would be
working?
me.
and heckle you. So
Is
it's
it
cool.
working?
Nope.
No, it's not.
Man.
So this is what would happen to me if I was the one doing the podcast. So you're fine.
Okay. I'm going to take a deep breath because you know what? I study stress response system. And when we're in our stress response, we can't think
So
straight.
your screen.
All right. Let's see.
It's like a screen within a screen within a screen.
How's that?
And then do the full
video,
screen, right?
Okay.
but not the
Could you
audio.
hear it?
No.
It's the audio.
You have to share it. Isn't there a thing where you share your audio?
No,
Like
that's in Zoom.
Well, maybe you can tell us because we're going to spend a lot of time watching this, and then we'll
All right.
and then we'll put the clip in later.
Okay, Dr. Kimberly Parker has a literary club for her students at Boston Ringe and Latin, Cambridge Ringe and Latin, and really teaching them about authors. And maybe since you know Dr. Dennis, and maybe if you want to share a little bit about Dr. Kimberly Parker, but she started really powerful. No, she has started a really powerful literary club for her students to teach them about authors all throughout history, but also contemporary authors who are writing books related to that are not part of the dominant conversation, that are not part of the that are from the global majority, and really helping them connect with history through narrative and through literature in a powerful way, so that they get to see themselves in a much more global perspective versus the small way in which people have been portrayed in the current dominant curriculum that's being used in public K through 12 schools. And then using that experience of the book club to help inspire activism and change for each of the students that are involved in creating scholars and lovers of literature. So
that's powerful. I mean, I think that's such an important part of the work we need to do, right? Is to bring forward alternate, and true narratives that are really different than the ones that we're getting in schools, and supporting and having educators support students to do that discovery together.
I think the narrative, the part that it's fiction is also that it's both fiction and nonfiction, because I think there's been this real move to nonfiction, right? And I think that's important and really helpful, but to be able to see yourself in narrative and story and in the journey of the beautiful ability to just sort of immerse yourself in stories that brighten and broaden our perspective. And so I think that that's key too, because who doesn't love a great novel?
Well, and nonfiction historicalizes people who are still alive and who still have vibrant and thriving cultures right now. So I think that often happens with Native American folks, right? This notion that they don't actually exist anymore. They're this thing in time. And it's no longer, an event that's over, and now those folks are not with us anymore. And obviously that's not true. But that's when we rely heavily on that, and that's our way of bringing people from the global majority forward, bringing Native folks forward is through these historical accounts, then we miss actually the richness of the current experience of folks from around the world. So I agree. I think just, and so that narrative and storytelling isn't just from a white person's perspective, is a really powerful and important thing for us to pay attention to as well. I appreciate that.
Well, congratulations, Dr. Parker. And I know that many of the school administrators and school teachers who listen to your wonderful podcast, they oftentimes come out of it with questions, but I really want this to be a time where they challenge themselves and each other, because literally there are tons of books. I mean, there's generations of writings and community work and volunteering on school boards and everything that people with underserved and minoritized identities have done for generations. And it's exhausting when no matter how much work you do, often free work, that people still come out of it pretending the work has not been going on, and they're asking questions. and oftentimes very basic questions. So this is where we have to throw it back and say, being an educator means you're constantly learning. Right. Same thing I tell medical and health professionals. Mm-hmm. Your last learning was not in that last training. Just like my specialist doctors, when they don't know something, they say, I'm going to research it and get back to you. And that's what school administrators and teachers need to be doing. Because if you're talking about iniquities, you're talking about standardized tests, and you're just complying with the legal standards, and you're acting like you're baffled that particularly Black students, for example, are scoring low. Well, we already know why they're scoring low. I mean, there could be individual level concerns, but there's more so aggregate concerns across a century. So when people keep asking why, it's really rhetorical. They know why, but they know that nothing is going to improve. So they keep pretending to be clueless. And that's where it's exhausting. So I've kind of given up on school administrators and school officials and school teachers, because it's just apparent that so many people, they want to keep going in circles. So this is where I hold families and communities accountable for doing what we've done for centuries. Find a way to method to boycott. Like, we don't have to comply with everything schools tell us to do. If the school's not doing what they're supposed to do on their end, which includes the materials that are accessible in their libraries, which includes the curriculum, which includes the tests, if they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, then communities and families need to do something on their part. And when I say that, people are like, oh my goodness, we can't boycott schools. That's interesting, because white taxpayers, including white liberals and white conservatives, they will boycott a school. Mm-hmm. They will boycott a school. Like, even if it's a school where they are required to send their children to, they will find a way to form a group and say, we are not showing up. Mm-hmm. So it's underserved people who have a tendency to follow the rules, follow the law, despite the rules and the law smacking you in your face for centuries.
Yeah, I appreciate you naming that. It was something that we talked about on Monday. The folks that created a long talk, they named the same thing. They essentially, I think you've been saying to Dr. Dennis, which is, I'm not going to tell you how to solve this. We're not going to give you the quick solution. And he named a framing of, he's like, choose your own front line, pick what it's going to be for you. And I heard that a lot through our conversation today, because it can get overwhelming with, this is why I asked, so what do we do first? Because I get overwhelmed, like, where do I go? But this idea of actually, there's plenty of places to start. And and you're right, as doctors do, if they're trying to solve a problem, you go and you figure it out. So so I think figuring out what our front line is, what is the place where we're going to start to take that stance, is a really important part. And you're right, parents have a lot of voice. I was thinking of, now I'm forgetting names today. That's my problem. Oakland Promise, not Oakland Promise, Opportunity Ticket.
Oh, the Black Oakland Organizing Project?
Yes. I think there is. So there's an example in Oakland of a woman who started an organization specifically targeted towards supporting parents to ask for what they need and want.
Oh, Reach. Reach. Yeah, Oakland Reach.
I'm having lots of name issues this afternoon. I'm going to call it. I'm almost 50.
You don't have to remember everything, I promise.
Well, this is somebody who I talk to and going to remember everything. I geek out on her all the time, and I talk to her, and she's a friend. And so when I don't remember people that I feel like I have a closeness to, I have a hard time with that. But she did that very thing. So she advocated all the way to the district level around changing the way our enrollment policies are, and specifically creating opportunities for students from underserved communities to have access to the highest quality schools. And it's changed the whole system of how we do things. So I think you're right. We can change.
And there are a few of the schools that continue to be difficult to get into for the, disproportionately high economic white families are taking active roles on enrollment and partnering with enrollment, and it's changing the demographics of those schools. So that's an actionable item, but it's difficult. And as you're saying, there are some families that will then choose not to engage and not to enroll their child in that school. And we have to be okay with the fact that we're going to lose those families. And that's fine with me, but it also has to be fine with the the folks that are chasing enrollment as enrollment declines, right? Like I don't want to.
It won't be fine with them. So this is why I always tell people, you got to think the worst, because you always have to, unfortunately, expect the worst out of people, because the people who seem sincere in equity and justice are oftentimes sincere in theory, right? In theory, because they will talk about changing the demographics of the school, but they won't change the curriculum. So you'll have entire Black schools, like the schools I was raised in, where almost everything was white people. Literally. I still remember the prologue of Canterbury Tales that I learned in 7th grade. I still remember that.
Yeah. No, I think
but we weren't taught Black culture.
Right.
No.
Yeah.
Yep.
No, I think you're right. I mean, we can change these external elements, enrollment policies, other things, but if we actually don't change how it feels to be in those spaces, then families are going to leave because it doesn't feel safe and it doesn't feel like they're being represented in the schools that are there.
And then the flip side, families may leave as we do change, and we have to be. It's both of those things at the same time. Yeah,
that's why you have to weigh the pros and cons, which is why when I do these trainings, I tell people I do not want everyone to be happy, because again, power majorities are not going to say, please take my power, I beg you. They're not going to do that, right? They want to keep the standardized test format. They want to keep the accreditation format. They want to keep the politicians who are harming the schools. They want to keep the libraries the way they are. They want to keep the curriculums. They want to keep profiting these publishers, and especially publishers from Texas. It's intentionally designed that way. And when they include more works from underserved people, they want the works to be written and published by the power majorities, cisgender, heterosexual, men, white people, USA Christians. It's the same routine, because they want everything to be based on their permission, and they want children and adults to believe that we need their permission and that they are the developers and controllers of factual information. And that's represented in museums, in schools, literally everywhere we go. And so that's why I tell people we can do a question answer session, but I really prefer you all being honest about your discomfort. Because if you're quiet during my trainings, I pretty much figure out that I'm going to receive an anonymous white person email the next day calling me a nigger. That's just how it's been, which means that people are accustomed to pretending that they're going to change something. That's how they waste our time, right? But they know that nothing's going to change. So I tell people, you have to be honest. Do you really want change? If you really want change, what are you willing to do to help changes happen and to annually evaluate? And if you don't want change, you just got to be honest about why you don't want it. You just got to be honest. And you don't need teachers' unions for teachers to make changes happen. Like, teachers are running their mouths on Twitter. And I'm like, this is interesting. You're not afraid of being fired right now, right? You're not afraid of that, right? But you're pretending that you're afraid of being fired any other time. So that's the inconsistency and the hypocrisy there. And so I tell people, you have to be consistent.
Yeah, that's a great place to end. We're already past our time, Dr. Dennis. And so it would be wonderful to know how people can connect with you and learn more about your training. So can you remind everybody how to find you? And I apologize for giving the name of your organization wrongly at the beginning. So
you're absolutely fine. Thank you.
365 Diversity.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me here. It's 365 Diversity. You go to 365diversity.com. And just to let you know that I do not cater to power majorities and how they feel my tone and my words should be, because that's how inequities and injustices happen in the first place. So you can't tell me I want justice, but I want it in a way that's going to make white people comfortable. Right. I want justice, but I want it in a way that's going to make heterosexuals comfortable. In that case, you don't want justice, so don't contact me. It's pretty simple task on your part. But if you do want work done, which includes my expertise in curriculum development, curriculum changes, annual assessments, I want you to understand, if you want inclusion and equity, which includes changing curriculum in the libraries and classes, this does not have to be permission from the accreditation agency. accreditors do not have to say, yay, we want justice, because they're never going to say that. So if you're waiting for politicians and accreditors to give you permission, that means you do not want equity. And you got to be honest about that as well.
Well, thank you so much. I feel like this was a good follow-up to our conversation, our last episode, and really that idea of find your front line. Where's your front line, and step up to it. And that's what at the Awakening Educator we're going to continue to try to do, is find our front line and step up to it, and keep moving towards it. I really appreciate it. It was a really powerful conversation.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dennis.
And please, if you like what you heard, subscribe, find us wherever you listen to podcasts, subscribe to us on YouTube. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Dennis.